Hey, I'm Brad with Wooten CPA, and my goal is to bring peace to your finance and tax responsibilities. One of the ways that I do that is through these videos. This is where I take more complex tax and finance topics and I try to break them down to make them simpler and easier to understand for you. So what are we talking about today? Today we're going to do a tax return walkthrough, Pastor Edition. And so what's that going to look like? Well, we're going to cover a couple of topics that are very unique to pastors. First, we're going to cover the minister housing allowance. This is unique to pastors. It's tax-free income that you get in order to provide a home for your family. It has its roots in the parsonage allowance, where the church would actually provide the home for you, but now it can be a cash designation as part of your pay from the church or missions organization that you work with. We're then going to talk about self-employment income, or SECA. This is for pastors who have not opted out. Some have opted out. They can file a form with the IRS to opt out of that self-employment tax. But for those of you who haven't, we're going to cover that and how you look for that to make sure it is correct on your tax return. We're going to cover a few other items that are not specific to pastors, but they happen a lot of times on pastor tax returns and couples returns, so we're going to cover those as well. That's the Child and Dependent Care Credit on Form 2441. We're also going to cover the Child Tax Credit, which is Form 8812, and we're going to cover the Credit for Retirement Contributions, which is Form 8880. So we're going to do a walkthrough where, maybe you want to prepare your own tax return. You think it's pretty simple. You have just a W-2 and you want to prepare it yourself. Or maybe you just want to understand your tax return a little bit better so that when you sit down with your tax preparer, you can go through it with them and ask more educated questions and understand your situation a little bit better. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to the computer where we're going to walk through that tax return for you.
All right, we are at the computer now. We have our information pulled up for our tax return, so we are going to walk through this real quick. Now, we have a married couple. The husband is the pastor of a small church. His wife is an employee of the church. She works there but is not pastoral staff, so he is the only pastoral staff. They have 2 kids, and we're going to walk through the only income they have is this income from the church, 2 W-2s to report. So we have those pulled up because the first thing we're going to do is show you the difference between a pastor W-2 and a typical W-2. So on a typical W-2, this is what you're familiar with seeing. Boxes 1 through 6 are all filled in. This is your wages and taxable income, your federal withholding, your Social Security and Medicare wages, as well as your Social Security and Medicare tax withheld. This is the state information down here, state wages, usually the same, very rarely different from your federal wages, and your state income tax withheld. This is your typical W-2, what you're used to seeing. Now, on a pastor W-2, you will notice that these boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all empty. So that is because a pastor is treated as an employee for employment law as well as for income tax purposes. But for Social Security and Medicare, a pastor is not in FICA, they are in SECA, and they pay self-employment tax instead of FICA. So these boxes will be empty, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you see this, if you're not used to a pastor W-2, or you take it to a tax preparer who's not used to a pastor W-2, they will think that your W-2 is incorrect. But it is correct. Pastor is not a 1099 recipient. They do get a W-2 because they are an employee for income tax and employment law purposes. However, self-employed for Social Security and Medicare. The pastor also has MHA, which is a portion of his pay that is designated as the minister housing allowance. So his total pay here is $50,000, with $20,000 of it designated as minister housing allowance. He also has dependent care benefits, where the organization provided care for his children so that both he and his spouse could work. You won't see this too often in a church, but in a missions organization where you might have attended a conference during the year and put your children in childcare, that will show up on your W-2. Our pastor also has $3,000 of retirement income here on his W-2. So we will jump over to the tax return and walk through what you should be looking for and what a normal pastor tax return will look like. So we're here on the 1040. This is the 2019 version, so this is what you will be completing in the early months of 2020 to file your 2019 tax return. First part is just your information, name, address, social security number, your dependents, their social security numbers, and their relationship to you. Then we get down into the meat of the tax return. So the first thing we're going to have is your taxable wages. This is $44,000 for our couple. That's the $14,000 for the spouse, plus the 30,000 here for the pastor gives you 44,000 of taxable wages. In this example, our pastor and his wife do not have any other income. So they don't have interest income, they don't have a Schedule C business on the side, they're not getting any retirement distributions, no other income here for this pastor and his wife. And so our total income is that $44,000 we got from our two W-2s. Now, adjustments to income here on line 8A, this is actually 1/2 of the self-employment tax, but we'll get to that in a minute, a little bit later in our video. So once you subtract that deduction from your total income, you reach your adjusted gross income, or your AGI. Then our pastor and his wife are taking the standard deduction, along with about 90 to 95% of other Americans. Now that they have increased and doubled that standard deduction, most people will be taking that and not itemizing anymore. So that standard deduction for this coming tax season will be $24,400 for a married couple filing joint. You subtract that from their adjusted gross income to get their taxable income, roughly $16,000. Now that leaves them for a married couple filing joint in the 10% tax bracket, which makes our tax very easy to calculate. Simply 10% of that taxable income, which is about $1,600. Now there are some tax credits that we get to take against that tax liability. One of them is the child tax credit. The total amount is $2,000 per child. However, you only get that amount if you have enough tax to offset that credit. So you can see our pastor and his wife do not have $4,000 of tax liability, so they will not get the full $2,000 for that child tax credit. The reason why they're not getting $1,608 is because there's about $600 of other tax credits that are also being used right here, which is your difference between the $1,010 and your $1,608 of total tax credits right here. That's 2 tax credits. We're going to cover those on a later schedule. So then line 14 is your total income tax liability after tax credits. Pastor and his wife, 0 income tax liability here on line 14. Great spot to be in, not owing any income tax. Now, after your income tax is calculated there, then you add in your self-employment tax, your Social Security and Medicare for a self-employed individual. For our pastor, that's $7,065. Now, your federal income tax withheld can offset both your income tax liability and your self-employment tax. They're 2 different taxes, but your federal withholding can count towards either one because they're both handled here on your 1040 return. So our pastor and his wife, if you remember, had $1,500 plus $4,500, which is a total of $6,000 of income tax withheld, federal withholding there. Now there is an additional child tax credit, so because we weren't able to use the full amount up here, of that $2,000 per child, $1,400 of it is refundable. So that means even if you didn't have any income tax liability, you can still use up to $1,400 per child for that child tax credit to increase your refund, offset your self-employment tax, and if you don't have any other tax, you get that amount refunded to you. So when we add the federal withholding plus our refundable child tax credit, we get $8,800 of total payments and withholding. The $8,800 compared to our $7,065 self-employment tax liability gives us a refund or an overpayment here of $1,735. So that is the 1040 return. It's 2 pages. They did change it this year. It's not the same as the 2018 form, so it is a little bit different. Now, there are other schedules and worksheets, as I mentioned, that we will go through now. The first one is going to be additional income and adjustments. As we mentioned, our pastor and his wife have no additional income. They did have that one deduction that I told you was 1/2 of their self-employment tax. That goes here on Schedule 1. Move it to the front page of the tax return right here and subtract it from your adjusted gross income to reach your taxable income. The second schedule is the additional taxes schedule. So our pastor has additional taxes, which are self-employment taxes. These are not income taxes. It's your Social Security and Medicare, and they're added here on the tax return. And then on the second page where we saw them earlier, $7,065 for self-employment tax. That's calculated on another worksheet later. Schedule 3, additional credits and payments. This is where we get our child child and dependent care credit. It's also where we get our retirement saving credit. So again, those are calculated on another sheet, reported here, and then that $600 total tax credit that we get is carried to the front page and is the difference between these two. That roughly 600 plus this 1,010 equals the 1,608 of total tax credits. Now, the next schedule is our Schedule SE. Now, for a pastor, this is very important. Our total wages subject to self-employment tax is $50,000 for our pastor. That is the $30,000 of wages in box number 1 on your W-2, plus your minister housing allowance of $20,000 gives you self-employment income of $50,000. This is where I see the biggest mistake on a self-prepared return or on a return prepared by a tax preparer who doesn't quite understand minister housing allowance and pastor taxes. Minister housing allowance, if you recall, did not go into our taxable income for income tax purposes on page 1 of the 1040, but it does go into the SE schedule here so that you are charged self-employment tax on your minister housing allowance. So if you are a pastor, make sure you double check that to make sure the program you're using or the preparer that you use did not leave out your minister housing allowance when calculating your self-employment tax. The next form is Form 2441. This is your child and dependent care expenses. Now on our W-2, we had $500 provided by the church itself or the mission organization to watch your children while you and your spouse worked. This form on the second page is basically going to take that $500 and it's going to justify that you actually had $500 of expenses to care for your child. Therefore, it's going to keep that $500 as tax-free income to you. If you don't put that on here, the program will take that $500, throw it into line 1 on your tax return, and it will charge you, it will count it as taxable income if you don't justify it here. Now, there's an additional $900 for this particular pastor and his wife that they paid to maybe a individual, a babysitter, or a child care location where they had their children so that they could both work. We're going to put that $900 here. You tell it how much was for each child, and then based on your income level, in this particular situation, you get a 22% tax credit for that money spent, and that's our $198 tax credit that we took over to our other schedule. The next one is our additional child tax credit. This is Schedule 8812. So I told you that there's $2,000 per child, so that's $4,000 total for this couple of potential child tax credit. We use the 1,010 to offset our income tax liability. We now have the 1,400 times 2 or 2,800 as additional refundable child tax credit that showed up on our tax return on page 2 as well. So they get the full amount there. The 2,800 goes to the second page of the 1040. Our 8880 is our qualified retirement savings contribution. So if you remember from our W-2, the pastor put $3,000 into his 403B retirement plan. And so that $3,000 comes in here on this schedule. You get a maximum credit for $2,000 per spouse. So if the wife had also put in $2,000, she would get to add that here. She didn't in this example. So again, based on their income level, they get a 20% tax credit for what they have saved in their retirement plan, which is $400, also carried to that previous schedule. So that is the end of our schedules and our tax return. All of these schedules calculate tax credits, adjustments, or additional income or additional taxes that then flow through to the 1040, either page 1 or page 2. So those are the basics. We'll jump back over to the whiteboard to give a quick summary and wrap up this video.
All right, and that's our walkthrough of the tax return pastor edition. So as you can see, our pastor and his spouse had 2 W-2s. They both worked for the church, and they had no other income. They had no other deductions. They took the standard deduction. Very basic tax return for a pastor and his spouse. And yet we still ended up with 10 pages, 2 for the tax return itself, and then 8 supplemental schedules and worksheets where we calculated some other tax credits, deductions, and taxes. So it adds up pretty quick. It's not quite as simple as what you might have thought, but that is about as simple as a pastor tax return gets. So hopefully that will help you when you're walking through your self-preparation, or help you as you're going back through a tax preparer that you might have hired, or if it helps you realize that you need to hire a tax preparer who understands pastor taxes, then this video has done its job as well, because my hope is to just help you understand these things and bring peace to your finance and tax responsibilities. So a couple of quick recaps when you are looking at your pastor tax return. That first one, if you remember, is your minister housing allowance is subject to SECA, self-employment. So you want to make sure that your minister housing allowance number is included on that Schedule SE as it is calculating your self-employment tax. The second one was your W-2 box 10. This was your dependent care credit, or your dependent care expenses on your W-2. If W-2 box 10 has a number in it, whether you're a pastor or not a pastor, you want to actually make sure that you do Form 2441 and you report those on that, as well as the provider of those dependent care expenses, so that it does not add that back into your taxable income. It will add that back in if you don't do Form 2441. Again, hopefully this video will help bring peace to your tax responsibilities. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube page so you get updates on any future videos. Comment below, ask questions, give feedback, let me know what you thought about this video, if there are any other topics you'd love me to discuss and to help you out with.